Every 2 minutes, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 people walk across the street at Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, Japan. 10 years ago, I traveled outside the United States for the first time in my life to this culturally rich country. In a moment of impulse fueled by intuition, I bought the ticket just 2 days before the start of the trip. From a practical standpoint, this didn't line up since I had to borrow money from a friend since I was living paycheck to paycheck. Yet, intuitively, I felt that this was something important in the grand scheme of my life. Japan was the first Asian country I visited, which soon turned into several. I visited Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong within the next year. This exploration came to a crescendo when I moved to Hong Kong long-term to pursue my MBA. Ever since residing in Asia, I wondered if there would ever be a reason to visit Japan again. That reason came by surprise when a friend told me they were visiting and asked me to join. When I saw that the time was exactly 10 years later on the same month, I knew that this was something symbolic. There are many things that happen in circles: stock markets, planetary orbits, patterns of history, human emotions, and biological cycles. Historians, hedge fund managers, and astrologers can all find common agreement on the significance of cycles. The big cycle. Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Capital with a net worth of $14 billion US. After a successful life, Dalio is committed to passing on his knowledge in several of his books, such as Principles, Life and Work, and Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Dalio explains that observing cycles is one of the core components of his investing thesis.
For example, I observed that most everything happens over and over again in slightly different ways. Some in obvious short-term cycles that are easy to recognize, so we know how to deal with them, like the 24-hour day. Some so infrequently that they haven't occurred in our lifetimes.
In his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Dalio talks about the framework that he uses to make macroeconomic predictions. He calls this framework the big cycle.
We must learn the lessons of the past to see that the circumstances we are now facing have in fact happened many times before and fall into a big cycle that repeats over and over again.
Dalio then uses his big cycle framework to look at the rise and fall of empires over history. His analysis has led him to look at the recent decline of the US empire and the rise of China.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies.
Recently, Ray Dalio has been using his big cycle model to warn people about the potential disruptive changes ahead.
History has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of when I say.
Will we see major global changes in the near future? The fourth turning. Neil Howe and William Strauss are historians who focus on generational cycles. Together, the pair coined the popular term millennial to describe people born between 1981 and 1996. Howe and Strauss analyzed the patterns of history using their generational cycle framework in the book The Fourth Turning: What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. The Strauss-Howe generational theory is described as follows. Historical events are associated with recurring generational personas or archetypes. Each generational persona unleashes a new era called the turning, lasting around 21 years, in which a new social, political, and economic climate exists. Howe describes how each turning, or period of 21 years, is like seasons of the weather.
Like nature's 4 seasons, the cycles of history follow a natural rhythm or pattern. Turnings come in cycles of 4. Each cycle spans the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 100 years, or the unit of time the ancients called the saeculum.
Howe and Strauss have identified 4 archetypes of generations that recur in history. These 4 types are prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. In a contemporary era, boomers are the prophet archetype, Generation X is nomad, millennials are hero, and Gen Z is the artist. All the generations combined together span 80 years, the length of the long human life, or a saeculum. The name of the 4 turnings are 1. High, 2. Awakening, 3. Unraveling, and 4. Crisis. These 4 turnings coincide with the birth of each new generational archetype every 21 years. Each archetype will enter their young adulthood in the following turning. For example, the hero archetype born during a third turning reaches their young adulthood during the time of the fourth turning. The first turning, when prophets are born, is the beginning of the cycle and comes after a period of disorder and chaos. In this period, people are content with conformity.
And this is Levittown. Here you can own your own home, complete with its own refrigerator, television set, and clothes dryer.
Howe elaborates.
The first turning is called a high. This is an era when institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, even if those outside the majoritarian center feel stifled by the conformity.
The second turning is when nomads are born. It is a time when institutions that were previously trusted became the target of criticism.
The second turning is an awakening. This is an era when institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. Just when society is reaching its high tide of public progress, people suddenly tire of social discipline and want to recapture a sense of inner authenticity.
You were coming out of a period when there was no possibility. This is the first period when you could actually transcend class, and music, art, fashion was one of the ways in which people did that.
The third turning is a period of decay where rugged individualism is seen as the way of survival. In this period, the hero archetype is born. Trusted institutions are now in a period of decay. We can see this sense of a dog-eat-dog world in movies released in the 80s such as The Terminator, Escape from New York, and Judge Dredd.
This room has been pacified.
The third turning is an unraveling. The mood of this era is in many ways the opposite of a high. Institutions are weak and distrusted, while individualism is strong and flourishing.
The fourth turning is when the artist archetype is born. Fourth turnings mark a major crisis that shapes the course of history. In this period, norms of the past begin to collapse as chaos begins to alter the fabric of society. The last fourth turning was World War II.
Finally, we enter the fourth turning, which is a crisis. This is an era in which America's institutional life is torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, always in response to a perceived threat to the nation's very survival. In every instance, fourth turnings have eventually become new founding moments in America's history.
This is one reason why millennials have seen so many crises, such as 9/11, the Great Financial Crisis, COVID, inflation, and the turmoil of political division. Astrology and the study of planetary cycles. Since the dawn of time, the ancients have looked at the night sky as a source of meaning for worldly events. Astrology first appeared in ancient Mesopotamia in 3000 BC. It developed its modern, known as the Hellenistic form, when it permeated through ancient Greece between the 1st and 2nd millennium BC. Notwithstanding whether or not there is a scientific basis to astrology, the orbits of the planets act as predictable long-term cycles, like the hands on a clock. Some notable cycles in astrology include the new moon, which occurs every 28 days. We know this to be associated with the calendar month as well as women's menstrual cycles. Lesser known but very significant is the orbit of Saturn, which takes 29.5 years. When a person turns 29, they may be faced with major challenges and set foundations for their career. These foundations turn into breakthroughs typically after the Saturn return ends between ages 31 and 32. Many celebrities have set up the foundations of their careers during a Saturn return. When Oprah Winfrey was 29 years old in 1984, she moved to Chicago to host AM Chicago, which was her first talk show. 2 years later, when she was 32, the show was officially renamed to The Oprah Winfrey Show. The show has now run for 25 seasons with a total of 4,561 episodes. J.K. Rowling is the author of the famous Harry Potter series with 600 million copies sold. Rowling finished her first Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, when she was age 29 in 1995. At the time, Rowling was living on welfare and state benefits.
Did you write it here?
This is really the way I finished Philosopher's Stone in here. This is really where I turned my life around.
Her mother had recently died, and she was struggling to afford food for her newborn daughter. After finishing her first book, Rowling was rejected by 12 publishers. It was not until Rowling finished her Saturn return at the age of 31.5 that she was finally accepted by a publisher who agreed to print her book. Another interesting cycle is the Saturn-Pluto cycle that occurs about once every 37 years. A Saturn-Pluto cycle is when Saturn and Pluto are aligned in the night sky. In 1914, there was an alignment of these two planets, which was the year the First World War broke out. In 1947, the planets aligned and we saw the beginning of the Cold War. Recently, in 2020, the planets aligned again and we saw the outbreak of COVID-19. What else might we be able to predict using astrology? Lessons from my Japan trip. When I first visited Japan 10 years ago, I was so inspired by the environment that I sat down and wrote myself a letter. Unexpectedly, many of the things I wrote then remain relevant today. I wrote about the enjoyment of writing, considering if I should take it more seriously. I'm just a few weeks in now to my decision to write for YouTube on a more continual basis. The original statement of interest in Japan a decade ago matched when I executed it almost exactly 10 years later. Back then, it was perhaps the boldest move I had ever taken, requiring all of my courage. The trip was full of intensity. My bank account was in the negative, I was terrified of leaving the US for the first time on a solo trip, and I was completely overwhelmed by the seemingly alien planet of Japan. This time was relatively relaxed. It's only a 3.5-hour plane from Hong Kong, the culture of an Asian city seems familiar, I enjoyed working on this article, and I got to shoot some good B-roll footage. In the length of a 10-year cycle, those things that seemed impossible and insane now are normal and routine. The meaning of the two trips marks the beginning of an idea and coming full circle to its integration. This is something I could not have predicted a decade ago. Conclusion. Cycles happen in sizes small and large. They are used by some of the world's leading experts to make decisions to the tune of billions of dollars. They are used by historians to understand the patterns of civilizations. We can find their application as the basis of spiritual divination tools. There is much more that could be said about cycles, but we will just have to leave that for a future episode.